The morning mist clung to the ancient stones of St. James's Palace as Sergeant Thomas Blackwell stood at his post, the weight of tradition evident in his ramrod-straight posture. Grey clouds hung heavy in the London sky, promising rain that would test the resilience of the guardsmen on duty. Blackwell remained motionless, his scarlet tunic a vivid splash of color against the weathered sandstone walls, his bearskin cap adding another foot to his already impressive height. Small droplets began to fall, speckling the pristine uniform that Blackwell had spent hours preparing before dawn. 7 years in the King's Guard had taught him that discomfort was irrelevant to duty. What the onlookers couldn't know was that Sergeant Blackwell represented something of an anomaly among the ranks of the King's Guard. The son of a literature professor and a research chemist, he was the first in his family to pursue military service rather than academia. Before donning the scarlet tunic, he had served 4 years in diplomatic protection, guarding British officials in embassies abroad. A commotion at the edge of the gathering drew momentary glances from the tourists. A cluster of men in expensive suits approached, led by a figure whose very stance suggested someone accustomed to deference. Former President Barack Obama moved with the confidence of a man who had once been the most powerful leader in the world, his entourage of assistants trailing behind like a jury instructed to follow his lead. At 63, Obama cut an imposing figure, over 6 feet tall with salt and pepper hair perfectly coiffed despite the dampening air. His bespoke suit bore the subtle sheen of fabric that cost more than most people earned in a month. A gold watch glinted at his wrist as he gestured expansively toward the palace. The guards, he announced, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear, are a perfect example of Britain clinging to outdated pageantry rather than practical function. Did you know they began as actual combat soldiers under Charles II? Now they're essentially ceremonial puppets trained to stand still and look decorative. Recently finished with a European-speaking tour where he'd been received with adulation at every stop, Obama had developed a reputation for intellectual confidence that occasionally bordered on arrogance. His speeches were considered brilliant but delivered with a condescension that left even supportive listeners feeling somehow diminished. "I'd wager it takes remarkable patience," Obama remarked to no one in particular, now standing directly across from Blackwell, "to stand there hour after hour without intellectual stimulation. Rather like watching paint dry, but being the paint." His companions chuckled obligingly at the joke, their laughter cutting through the respectful murmurs of other visitors. The former president leaned forward, resting his hands on the barrier that separated him from the guard. With each passing minute, his posture became more intrusive, until he was leaning well over the designated line, his umbrella now partially extending into the restricted space. "Sir," a palace security officer approached with professional courtesy, "I need to ask you to step back behind the barrier. For security reasons, we maintain a clear zone around all guard positions." Obama turned to the officer, his expression shifting from amusement to indignation with practiced ease. "Do you know who I am?" he asked, the question carrying the weight of a man accustomed to recognition opening doors. "Regardless of who you are, sir, the rules apply equally to all visitors," the security officer replied evenly. "I am Barack Obama, former President of the United States," he declared, his voice carrying across the courtyard. "I've dealt with genuine security situations on a global scale. This," he gestured toward the barrier with clear disdain, "is merely crowd control dressed up as security protocol. Nevertheless, sir, I must insist." "Very well," Obama interrupted, taking half a step back but maintaining his position of conversational dominance. "Let me demonstrate something to you all," the former president announced to his entourage. "Watch as I conduct a little experiment in human response." He turned to face Sergeant Blackwell directly, adopting what his colleagues recognized as his debate posture. "Guard," he began, his tone mockingly formal, "would you say your role here serves an actual security function, or is it primarily a tourist attraction?" Blackwell remained perfectly motionless, his gaze fixed forward as regulations demanded. "No opinion on the matter?" "Perhaps you're not permitted independent thought while on duty," Obama continued. "Let me try something simpler. What qualifications were required for your position? Physical stamina? Ability to withstand boredom? Skill at remaining decorative?" Several tourists had stopped to watch the uncomfortable scene unfold, their expressions ranging from embarrassment to indignation on the guard's behalf. An elderly woman shook her head disapprovingly. "Nothing to say? Not even a twitch of acknowledgement?" Obama pressed, his smile growing sharper. Perhaps I was mistaken about the physical stamina requirement. Clearly, the primary qualification is the ability to impersonate a statue. Throughout this barrage, Blackwell maintained his forward gaze, his disciplined bearing betraying nothing of the thoughts behind his impassive expression. His training had prepared him for far worse than verbal provocation. The rain had intensified, driving most casual observers away, but Obama seemed energized rather than deterred by the deteriorating conditions. Each raindrop that spattered against his umbrella seemed to fuel his sense of superiority, as if the weather itself were providing a backdrop for his performance. One of his junior associates, a young man named Timothy who had only recently joined Obama's staff, hung back from the group. His discomfort with the former president's behavior was increasingly evident in his posture and expression. Timothy had initially been honored when offered a position with the renowned statesman, but moments like this, watching Obama belittle others to elevate himself, made him question his career choice. A middle-aged woman with an Australian accent, who had been watching the scene with increasing disapproval, finally spoke to the security officer. "Is this sort of behavior common? Where I'm from, we're taught to respect these guards, not harass them." "It's not common, ma'am," the officer replied quietly. "Most visitors understand the tradition and respect it." "Well, someone should remind the former president that respect is a two-way street," she commented, loud enough for several nearby tourists to nod in agreement. Obama's attention, momentarily diverted by his self-congratulatory summation, returned to Sergeant Blackwell with renewed focus. His eyes narrowed as he noticed something he had previously overlooked. "What's this?" he asked, his voice sharpening with interest. "Our statuesque friend appears to have something in his pocket." Indeed, the outline of a small rectangular object was barely visible in the breast pocket of Blackwell's tunic. "Tell me, guard, what sort of picture book do they allow you to carry? Something to keep you entertained during those long hours of immobility?" The mockery in his tone was unmistakable. When Blackwell maintained his discipline in silence, Obama's expression hardened from amusement to something closer to annoyance. Without warning, he reached across the barrier and plucked the small volume from Blackwell's pocket with deft fingers. The gesture was so unexpected and inappropriate that even Obama's entourage gasped. One of them started to object but fell silent as the former president examined his prize. "Now, let's see what keeps our sentinel occupied during his..." Obama's voice cut off abruptly as he read the title of the book he now held. "Contemporary Applications of Constitutional Law and Modern Jurisprudence," he read aloud, his tone shifting from mockery to disbelief. He flipped the book open, revealing dense legal text with highlighted passages and careful annotations in the margins. "A rather ambitious prop for a ceremonial guard," he declared, closing the book with a sharp snap. "I wonder, did they provide this to you to make tourists believe the King's Guard consists of scholar soldiers rather than men selected primarily for their height and ability to stand still?" The security officer who had intervened earlier returned quickly, his expression concerned. "Sir, I must ask you to return the guardsman's personal property and step back behind the barrier immediately." With poor grace, Obama handed the book to the security officer rather than returning it directly to Blackwell. "This matter isn't concluded," he declared. "In fact, I think it deserves further examination in a more formal setting." He reached into his jacket and produced an embossed card, which he handed to the security officer. "Sergeant Blackwell is hereby invited to appear at my lecture tomorrow at 10 o'clock. Westminster Hall. He will explain this theatrical prop and his apparent contempt for honest inquiry." "On what grounds could you possibly?" the security officer began. "Disrespect," Obama interrupted. His silence when directly addressed by a former world leader constitutes disrespect to democratic institutions. His carrying of legal texts appears to be a deliberate misrepresentation of his role and qualifications. Both matters warrant formal examination. Westminster Hall bustled with its usual morning activity the following day. The arrival of Sergeant Thomas Blackwell caused this familiar rhythm to falter momentarily, conversations pausing mid-sentence as people turned to stare at the unexpected sight of a King's Guard in full ceremonial uniform navigating the historic hall. Blackwell moved with military precision, his scarlet tunic and bearskin cap creating a startling contrast against the subdued colors of the environment. Despite the attention, his bearing remained impeccable, shoulders squared, chin up, steps measured and confident. "Is that actually a royal guard?" a junior assistant whispered to her colleague. "Full dress uniform too," the older man confirmed, watching Blackwell pass. "Must be Obama's 10 o'clock. He's been talking about it all morning during the preparation meeting." The event coordinator looked up in surprise as Blackwell approached her desk. Sergeant Thomas Blackwell reporting as directed, he stated simply, his voice carrying the crisp precision of his military bearing. Are you represented by counsel, Sergeant? She asked, noting he stood alone. That won't be necessary, Blackwell replied with quiet confidence that left the coordinator momentarily nonplussed. Mr. Obama can be rather formidable, she cautioned, lowering her voice slightly. Thank you for your concern, Blackwell responded with a slight nod of acknowledgement. Obama entered, his tailored suit impeccable as he strode to the podium. The assembled crowd stood as Obama took his position. Today we address an unusual matter, he announced, his voice carrying the practiced projection of decades in public speaking. This proceeding concerns potentially disrespectful behavior toward a former head of state and possible misrepresentation of qualifications. Distinguished guests exchanged puzzled glances, the unusual nature of the proceeding immediately apparent to those familiar with Obama's typically more diplomatic approach. For the record, Obama continued, yesterday while visiting the grounds of St. James's Palace, I observed the sergeant carrying materials suggesting expertise in areas outside his professional capacity. When questioned about this discrepancy, he displayed contempt through deliberate silence and refusal to acknowledge my inquiry. Blackwell stood at perfect attention before the podium, his posture reminiscent of his guard post, though he had removed his bearskin cap and tucked it properly under his left arm in accordance with military protocol for indoor settings. Do you understand why you have been summoned here today, Sergeant Blackwell? Obama asked, his tone suggesting the question was merely a formality before moving to judgment. I understand that you believe I have committed some form of disrespect, sir, Blackwell replied evenly. With all due respect, Mr. President, Blackwell began when invited to respond to the charges. The regulations governing the King's Guard explicitly prohibit engaging in conversation while on ceremonial duty. This rule exists for security reasons as well as ceremonial purposes. Security reasons? Obama repeated with evident skepticism. Are we to believe that answering a simple question might compromise royal security? That seems rather convenient. Royal Guard Standing Order 17, paragraph 3 states clearly that guards on ceremonial duty may only break silence in case of emergency or when officially relieved of post, Blackwell responded. Obama lifted the book from his podium, the same volume he had taken from Blackwell's pocket the previous day. Would you identify this item for the Assembly? That is my personal copy of Contemporary Applications of Constitutional Law and Modern Jurisprudence by Professor James Harrington, sir. And you expect us to believe that you, a ceremonial guard, not only possess but actively study advanced legal theory during your duties? Obama's tone dripped with skepticism. This appears to be a rather transparent attempt to present yourself as something more than you are. Blackwell remained composed despite Obama's increasingly aggressive tone. The regulations permit guards to carry a single small personal item during extended shifts, sir. Many guards choose to carry photographs of family. I chose reading material related to my interests. The tradition dates back to the Victorian era, Blackwell added, his knowledge of military history evident. During the long ceremonial duties at Queen Victoria's court, guards were permitted small personal effects to maintain morale during extended shifts. The practice has continued as part of the regiment's heritage and has been formally codified in the modern standing orders that govern ceremonial duties. Several distinguished guests in attendance nodded appreciatively at this historical context. One elderly diplomat in the back row, who wore a regimental tie suggesting military service in his past, smiled slightly at the guard's composed explanation. Obama's face registered a flicker of annoyance at being educated on historical matters at his own event. I hardly think Victorian-era concessions to board guardsmen constitute relevant precedent in a modern setting, he remarked dismissively. Your interests? Obama repeated mockingly. And we are to believe that constitutional law just happens to be light reading for someone whose professional obligations include standing motionless for hours? This strikes me as deliberate misrepresentation. The silver-haired diplomat in the front row rose to his feet. Mr. President, if I might address the Assembly regarding the appropriateness of this matter. You have not been recognized, Sir William, Obama cut him off sharply. This is an inquiry under my authority, not a typical diplomatic exchange. With respect, Mr. President, even in informal inquiries, basic principles of fairness apply, Sir William persisted, his tone respectful but firm. The sergeant should be permitted to respond fully to these somewhat unusual accusations. Obama's expression darkened momentarily before he mastered himself. Very well. The assembly will hear the sergeant's response, though I expect it to be brief and to the point. Mr. President, Blackwell began, his voice clear and steady, before addressing your specific questions, I believe it would be helpful to provide some context regarding my background and qualifications. He stood with perfect military bearing, his scarlet uniform immaculate under the hall lights. I am Sergeant Thomas Blackwell of the King's Guard, having served in that capacity for 7 years. Prior to that, I worked in diplomatic protection for 4 years. Yes, your military credentials are not in question, Obama interjected impatiently. If I may continue, Blackwell responded with unshaken composure. Before joining the military, I completed a law degree at Durham University, graduating with first-class honors. My specialization was in constitutional and military law, with particular focus on the intersection of historical ceremonial functions in modern legal frameworks. A ripple of surprise moved through the hall. Obama's expression froze momentarily, his hand pausing mid-gesture as the implications of this statement registered. During my time at Durham, Blackwell continued in the same measured tone, I authored 3 papers on ceremonial military units and their legal standing in modern governance structures. One of these, Ceremonial Functions as Legal Continuity, the Role of Traditional Guards in Modern Constitutional Monarchies, was published in the British Journal of Constitutional Studies. Several distinguished guests were now leaning forward in their seats, their expressions transformed from puzzled amusement to genuine interest. Upon completion of my degree, I chose to enter military service rather than pursuing a traditional legal career. This decision was based on personal interest in the practical application of the constitutional principles I had studied. However, I have maintained my legal education through continuing professional development. Blackwell reached into his tunic and produced several folded documents, which he presented to the event coordinator with military precision. These are my educational credentials, publication records, and current professional development certifications, which may be examined. These appear to be in order. Mr. President, the coordinator confirmed after examining the documents. The sergeant's legal qualifications are quite extensive. Obama cleared his throat, shuffling the papers before him in what appeared to be an attempt to regain his composure. While these credentials are unexpected, he acknowledged stiffly, they do not address the matter of your silence when addressed by a former head of state. As I began to explain earlier, Sir, Blackwell continued, Royal Guard Standing Order 17 explicitly prohibits guards on ceremonial duty from engaging in conversation except in emergencies. This is not merely a theatrical rule but has practical security implications. Before Obama could respond, the main doors opened to admit a distinguished woman in formal diplomatic attire, accompanied by the hall administrator. Conversations immediately hushed as recognition spread through the gallery. Dame Eleanor Blackwood, senior diplomat and former ambassador to the United States. Mr. President, Dame Eleanor said, approaching the front of the hall, I apologize for the interruption, but I've received multiple concerned communications regarding this unusual proceeding. Given the nature of the concerns raised, I believe my intervention is appropriate at this stage. She turned briefly toward Blackwell, who stood at perfect attention. Sergeant, thank you for your patience during these irregular proceedings. Would you be seated for a moment while diplomatic matters are addressed? Dame Eleanor returned her attention to Obama. Mr. President, the record reveals several serious procedural irregularities that cannot be overlooked. The summoning of a serving guardsman without proper authorization, the public taking of his personal property, and the apparent use of diplomatic privilege to address a personal grievance all raise significant concerns. Obama's face had flushed deeply, the stark contrast to his earlier confident demeanor evident to everyone in the hall. Dame Eleanor, I was merely seeking to address what I perceived as disrespect to democratic institutions. The record suggests otherwise, she interrupted firmly. Your characterization of the sergeant's uniform as a costume and theatrical display, your removal of his personal property without permission at the palace, and your comments regarding his intellectual capacity all suggest a personal rather than procedural concern. Sergeant Blackwell rose to his feet, his bearing impeccable. Only that I understand the former president's genuine concern for maintaining respect for democratic institutions, which is an important principle. While the approach in this instance may have been procedurally flawed, The underlying value of respecting our institutions, both diplomatic and military, is one I believe we all share. The magnanimity of his response was not lost on those present. Where many might have seized the opportunity for righteous vindication after such treatment, Blackwell chose instead to highlight common ground and shared values. As Sergeant Blackwell resumed his post at St. James's Palace that afternoon, tourists gathered as usual to observe the living symbol of Britain's traditions. Few of them could have guessed that the scarlet uniformed figure standing in disciplined silence had hours earlier delivered a masterclass in legal reasoning that had humbled a former president of the United States. Behind every uniform stands a complete human being whose depths and capabilities cannot be judged by appearance alone. Sergeant Blackwell's story reminds us that respect for tradition means understanding its true purpose and substance, not merely its outward form.